In the echoes of history, the lives of ordinary people often brushed against the extraordinary. While some characters in this story are born from imagination, others, like Augustus the Emperor, General Crassus, and the poet Virgil, are drawn directly from the pages of the past. Together, they create a narrative that blends the real with the fictional, offering a glimpse into what could have happened. Chapter 1: The Streets of Rome. The sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the ancient streets of Rome. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut stone, mingling with the earthy aroma of the Tiber and the sharp tang of the crowded market stalls. The city was alive, louder than it had ever been, buzzing with the energy of change. Under the watchful eye of the new emperor, Rome was transforming. Buildings rose higher, the roads grew wider, and the marble facades gleamed whiter than they had ever done in the days of the Old Republic. Lucius Marcellus, a seasoned stone carver, made his way slowly through the winding streets, his eyes drifting toward the towering columns of the Temple of Mars Ultor in the distance. His hands were still dusty from the day's work, pale from hours of shaping the stone that would become part of the temple's grand facade. His thoughts wandered as his feet carried him along familiar paths, now altered by the ever-growing cityscape. He had spent years working on Augustus's building projects, and though the emperor's name was spoken with awe in every corner of the city, Lucius could not shake a sense of uncertainty about the future that lay ahead. He passed the recently completed Ara Pacis, a monument to peace, they said, though Lucius had seen little of that in his lifetime. The wars, the bloodshed, the endless battles between powerful men, it was all fresh in his memory. The Ara Pacis was magnificent, its detailed carvings standing in stark contrast to the memories of his youth, when Rome was caught in the throes of civil war. He remembered his father and brothers leaving for distant fields of battle, only for some to never return. The Republic had crumbled, and with it, so had the dreams of many Roman families like his own. Now, the marble walls of Augustus's Forum and temples promised stability, yet Lucius couldn't help but wonder at what cost. The streets around him were filled with the hum of everyday life, vendors shouting their prices, the clatter of cartwheels on stone, and the distant sound of water pouring from fountains newly adorned with intricate carvings. A group of children ran past, their laughter echoing off the walls, oblivious to the world of politics and power that shaped their city. Lucius watched them, envying their innocence, their complete unawareness of the fragility of the world around them. As he neared the Forum of Augustus, a sudden commotion drew his attention. People began to gather, murmuring in excitement, their heads turning toward the main road. Lucius stopped, standing at the edge of the crowd, his curiosity piqued. A grand procession was approaching, its arrival signaled by the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the paved road and the glitter of armor catching the fading light. At the head of the column, atop a gleaming white horse, was Augustus himself, the man who had transformed Rome into something almost unrecognizable. The crowd erupted into cheers as the emperor rode past, flanked by his personal guard, each man polished and stern in his gleaming bronze armor. Lucius watched, his face expressionless, as the procession passed. Augustus rode tall and proud, his posture immaculate, his face calm and untroubled. The emperor's likeness had been immortalized in countless statues and carvings throughout the city, but seeing him in person, Lucius felt the weight of the man's presence. Here was the ruler who had ended the chaos, who had promised a new era of peace. But behind the emperor's calm facade, Lucius knew there had been bloodshed, betrayals, and a web of political maneuvering that only the most powerful could ever hope to navigate. The procession moved on, disappearing down the street, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Lucius lingered for a moment, watching the spot where Augustus had been, the cheers still ringing faintly in his ears. His thoughts turned back to his own place in this grand city. A stone carver, nothing more, nothing less. His hands had helped shape these monuments to power, these tributes to an empire reborn, yet he felt more like a spectator than a participant in the new Rome that Augustus was building. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Lucius resumed his walk, his pace slow and deliberate. The streets were quieter now, the day winding down. He passed through narrow alleys where the shadows clung to the walls, stretching like dark fingers across the stone. The temple of Mars Ultor loomed large ahead of him, its columns rising into the twilight sky, the work unfinished but already impressive. It would stand as a symbol of Augustus' vengeance for Julius Caesar, a monument to the emperor's determination and his grip on power. Lucius sighed, his mind still heavy with thoughts of the past and the uncertain future. The wars had taken so much from him, from all of them. And now, under the shadow of Augustus's grand vision for Rome, he wondered where men like him, ordinary men, fit into the emperor's plans. Would they be remembered, or would their stories be lost beneath the marble and stone? With the day's work behind him and the streets now quieting, Lucius made his way home, blending into the city that was no longer the Rome of his youth. The new Rome, Augustus's Rome, was a place of order, grandeur, and ambition. But for Lucius, it was also a place of questions, the answers to which lay somewhere beyond the shining monuments and towering temples in the uncertain years yet to come. Chapter 2. Whispered Dissension. The warm mist of the baths clung to the stone walls, curling lazily toward the high ceilings, as the quiet murmur of voices echoed off the marble surfaces. Lucius Marcellus sat on the edge of a bench, his body sinking into the hot waters, but his mind was far from at ease. The soft lapping of water against the sides of the pool was drowned out by the conversation unfolding in the shadowed alcove nearby. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the whispers of political debate had a way of creeping into the most private corners of the city. Today, they had found him here, in the baths, where men gathered not only to cleanse their bodies, but to air their grievances. His patron, Marcus Scribonius, a senator of moderate influence, reclined nearby, engaged in a low, tense conversation with another man, his face half obscured by the steam. Scribonius was an old acquaintance of Lucius's father, and though their relationship was formal, Lucius owed much of his recent work to the senator's patronage. In return, he offered his ear and silence, listening without interjecting, a skill that had served him well in the shifting politics of the city. Augustus speaks of restoring the Republic, Scribonius muttered, his voice barely carrying above the gentle splashing of water. Yet the Senate is little more than a decoration now. Have you not seen it? His powers grow with every year. The other man nodded, his brow furrowed. The Senatus Consultum, the legal council of Rome, reduced to a formality. We give advice, but what weight does it carry when Augustus holds the imperium? Even the conspiracy last year, Murena tried to restore the Republic, and what happened? Executed. Silenced. Lucius sat still, his eyes fixed on the rippling surface of the water before him, but his ears took in every word. He had heard of the conspiracy, of course. Everyone had. Gaius Murena, once a trusted ally of Augustus, had been implicated in a plot to assassinate the emperor, only to be caught and swiftly executed. It had been a brutal reminder that, despite the image of peace Augustus projected, not all were content with his reign. The people praise him as the savior of Rome, Scribonius continued, his voice laced with irony. The man who brought an end to the civil wars. But what did we gain in return? A monarchy in all but name. First citizen? Princeps? It is a title Augustus wears lightly, but the reality is clearer every day. The Senate bends to his will. We do not debate as we once did, not freely. The Republic is slipping away. Lucius shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Scribonius's words echoed what he had often heard whispered in the corners of the city. Men of rank questioning whether Augustus's reign truly signified a restoration of the Republic or a veiled descent into autocracy. Augustus had carefully maintained the appearance of republican governance, holding the title of princeps rather than king, refusing the crown that so many feared would mark the end of Rome's republican traditions. But those who knew the inner workings of the Senate saw the truth more clearly. Lucius had never been a man of politics, but he could not help but feel a growing unease as he listened to the murmured discontent around him. The memory of the Republic, of a Senate that held true power, was slipping away. Men like Scribonius, whose families had served the Republic for generations, now found themselves trapped between loyalty to Augustus and the desire for the freedom they had lost. "Do you remember," the other man said quietly, "when the Senate once debated openly, when we could challenge decisions without fear? Now, we sit in our curule chairs, nodding along as the emperor makes his decrees. There is no debate, only the pretense of one." Scribonius let out a sigh, the sound heavy with resignation. "It is true, but what can we do? Murena tried to act, and it cost him his life. Augustus is no fool. He maintains a delicate balance, just enough power to keep us in line, but not so much that the people rise up. They see the monuments, the temples, the forums he builds, and they believe him to be a god among men. And perhaps he is, but for how long?" Lucius dipped his hand into the water, watching as it disturbed the surface, ripples spreading out in gentle circles. The conversation had stirred something in him, a doubt that had been growing slowly over the years. He had once believed, like many, that Augustus had saved Rome, had ended the endless cycles of war and brought peace. But now, as he listened to these men of the Senate speak, he wondered if the peace was merely a facade, a carefully constructed illusion that concealed the slow erosion of the Republic's values. The conversation drifted to other matters, the voices lowering further until they became nothing more than a soft hum. Lucius leaned back against the warm stone, his mind still tangled in the complexities of what he had overheard. The shadow of the conspiracy against Augustus hung in the air, a reminder that not all were willing to accept the emperor's growing control. Yet, those who acted in defiance were silenced, their fates a stark warning to anyone who might challenge the new order. As he left the baths, the evening air cool against his skin, Lucius walked slowly through the streets of Rome, past the grand temples and statues that proclaimed Augustus's greatness. The city was quiet now, the last light of day fading into twilight. In the distance, the Senate House stood, its imposing silhouette dark against the sky. Inside, men like Scribonius would continue their whispered debates, trapped in a system that had changed beyond recognition. Lucius wondered what the future held for Rome. Would the Republic ever return, or had it already been lost, buried beneath the marble of Augustus's monuments? The questions gnawed at him, unanswered, as he disappeared into the deepening shadows of the city. Chapter 3. The Frontier Beckons. The air in Rome felt thick with the heat of late summer as Lucius Marcellus sat at his workbench, chisel in hand, carefully shaping a slab of marble for yet another statue to adorn one of Augustus's endless projects. The sound of stone meeting steel echoed faintly in the quiet of the workshop, but Lucius found it difficult to focus. A letter lay unfolded on the table beside him, its edges already fraying from where he had anxiously opened and reread it a dozen times. It had arrived from the distant frontier, carried by messengers from Hispania. His brother, Titus, had written from the wild, rugged lands where Rome's legions were fighting to tame new territories. Lucius's eyes drifted from his work to the letter once more. In Titus' bold, rough script, the harsh reality of Rome's expansion unfolded. The words painted a picture of endless battles, grueling marches through unforgiving mountains, and the constant threat of ambush from the Cantabrians and Asturians, tribes who resisted fiercely against the Roman incursion. Despite years of conquest, the people of Hispania's northern frontiers had not submitted, their mountainous homeland proving a formidable barrier to Roman domination. Augustus, always determined, had sent more legions to crush the resistance, to bring these defiant lands into the fold of the empire. Lucius picked up the letter, letting his eyes trace the lines that had kept him awake at night. Titus had always been the stronger of the two, a soldier from his youth, eager to fight for Rome's glory. Lucius, though older, had chosen a quieter path, his hands shaping stone while Titus's hands wielded a sword. But now, as he read his brother's account of the brutal campaigns, Lucius felt the weight of Rome's ambition pressing down on him in a way he had never before understood. The Cantabrians are like ghosts, Lucius. They know this land far better than we ever could. We chase them through the valleys and over the mountains, only to find them waiting in ambush. Every hill hides a new danger. The forests are thick and dark, the terrain treacherous. Many of my comrades have fallen, too many. We build forts, but they are never safe. Every night, we hear the howls from the mountains, the sound of them taunting us from the shadows. Lucius could almost see the scene through his brother's words. The legions, weary and scarred, building fortifications under the looming presence of mist-shrouded peaks. Their fires flickering in the dim light as they cast wary glances into the dark forests that surrounded them. The scent of wet earth, the sharp tang of pine, and the distant echo of footsteps on rocky paths filled his mind. It was a world so far removed from the warm, bustling streets of Rome, where marble monuments gleamed under the sun and Augustus's power seemed unshakable. But it wasn't the vivid descriptions of battle that had unsettled Lucius the most. It was the news of Titus's injury, buried halfway through the letter, almost casually mentioned, as if his brother had not wanted to worry him. I took a wound in the last skirmish. Nothing too serious, they say, but it has laid me up for a while. I'll heal, I'm sure of it. Don't tell Mother, she would worry herself sick. Lucius clenched the letter tightly in his hands, the paper crumpling under his fingers. A wound. Nothing too serious, Titus had said, but Lucius knew his brother well. He would downplay the severity to avoid causing alarm, but the truth of war was that even the smallest injuries could fester, could turn deadly in the harsh conditions of the frontier. The knowledge gnawed at Lucius, filling him with a sense of helplessness. Here he was, carving stones for a city that was distant and serene compared to the violent reality of the frontier. Rome was expanding, stretching its borders ever outward, but for men like Titus, that expansion came with a heavy price. The letter ended with words meant to reassure, but they only deepened Lucius's unease. Tell Father I am doing my duty for Rome, for Augustus. This land will be tamed. It must be. We will break the Cantabrians and Asturians, just as we broke the Gauls. Augustus will not rest until these lands are part of the empire. I only hope to return home before too long to see what you have built, but I fear this war is far from over. Lucius let the letter fall back onto the table, his gaze lingering on the final lines. The wars were never over, it seemed. Even with Augustus's promise of peace and prosperity, the reality was that Rome's borders were constantly being tested, pushed outward through force. The legions were always somewhere, fighting to secure lands that would one day carry the weight of Rome's civilization, even as they strained to bear the weight of Rome's ambition. He thought of the faces he had seen in the streets, the veterans, scarred and limping, some missing limbs, others with hollow eyes that spoke of of things no man should witness. He had passed them without thinking, absorbed in his own work, his own small place in the grand design. But now, with his brother far away, injured and surrounded by enemies, Lucius felt the harsh truth pressing in on him. The empire was vast, its glory undeniable, but it was built on the backs of men like Titus, who bled and suffered so that Rome could continue to expand, to dominate. As the day waned, Lucius left his workshop and wandered the streets of Rome, the sounds of the city fading into the background as his mind remained fixed on the frontier. The grand temples and monuments of Augustus's reign rose around him, symbols of Rome's power, its reach. But Lucius could not help but see the other side of that power, the blood that stained the empire's edges, the sacrifices made by those whose names would never be etched into the marble walls of the Senate or the Forum. He passed a statue of Augustus, towering and regal, its outstretched hand pointing toward the horizon, as if beckoning Rome to conquer lands yet unseen. For the first time, Lucius felt a surge of bitterness. What was this endless pursuit of power worth if it cost the lives of men like his brother? Was Rome truly better for its conquests, or was it merely feeding an insatiable hunger for control? As the shadows lengthened and the streets grew quiet, Lucius made his way home, his thoughts heavy. The frontier beckoned, as it always did, with promises of glory and riches, of lands to be won and enemies to be subdued. But for Lucius, the only thing it offered was fear, for his brother, for his family, for the future of Rome itself. Chapter 4: The Augustan Propaganda. The early morning sun bathed the city of Rome in a soft, golden light, casting long shadows across the freshly restored columns of the Temple of Apollo. Lucius Marcellus stood at the base of the temple steps, his hands tracing the smooth surface of the marble. He had been working here for weeks now, chiseling away at the ornate carvings that adorned the temple's facade. Each detail, every flourish, was part of a grander design, an offering to the gods, yes, but also a symbol of something much more powerful, Augustus' vision of Rome. Lucius had never before been so close to the heart of such a monumental project. The Temple of Apollo had been one of Augustus's most cherished undertakings, a masterpiece that stood on the Palatine Hill near the emperor's own residence. Its gleaming marble walls and intricate decorations were not just a testament to the gods, but a reflection of Augustus himself, Rome's new Apollo, the restorer of peace, the bringer of civilization. As Lucius worked, he could not help but notice how the emperor's presence seemed to pervade every corner of the city, shaping not just its physical form, but the very way people thought about their lives and their past. The air was filled with the sound of hammers striking stone, the steady rhythm of laborers working to complete the temple before the end of the year. Amidst the noise, Lucius spotted a figure walking toward the site, his gait slow and deliberate. It was Publius Virgilius Maro, Virgil to most, his face pale but composed, his eyes focused on some distant thought as he approached. He had become a familiar presence at the temple, always in deep conversation with other men of letters who frequented the site, discussing ideas far removed from the concerns of craftsmen like Lucius. But today, as Virgil paused near the steps where Lucius worked, their eyes met briefly. Lucius inclined his head respectfully. He had heard much about the poet. It was said that Virgil was working on a great epic, something that would glorify Rome and cement Augustus's legacy for generations to come. The Aeneid, they called it. Lucius knew little of such works, but even he could sense their importance. Men like Virgil had the ear of Augustus himself, and their words carried a weight far beyond the ink they were written in. Virgil smiled faintly, as if amused by some private thought, and stepped closer. "You do fine work, stone carver," he said, his voice soft but measured, every syllable chosen with care. This temple will stand long after both of us are gone, a testament to our time." Lucius wiped the dust from his hands and stood, nodding in acknowledgement. "It is an honor to work on something so grand, though the credit belongs to those who design such things. I am but a simple craftsman." Virgil regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but your hands shape more than stone. They shape how people will see Rome for centuries to come. That is no small thing." Lucius hesitated. He had never thought of his work in such terms. To him, the restoration of temples, statues, and monuments was a matter of duty, of keeping the city whole and beautiful. But there was something deeper at play, something he was only beginning to understand. "Is that what we do then?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Shape how people see Rome?" Virgil's gaze sharpened, and he smiled knowingly. "Indeed, art, architecture, literature, all of it serves a purpose beyond the surface. Augustus understands this better than most. Through monuments like this temple, he tells a story of peace, of divine favor, of Rome's eternal destiny." Lucius frowned slightly. "And through poetry too, I suppose." Virgil chuckled, a dry sound. "Yes, even through poetry. The Aeneid is not just a tale of heroes and gods. It is a reflection of Rome's greatness, of the lineage Augustus claims, a direct line from Aeneas, the Trojan hero, to the Julian family. It reminds us that Rome's empire is not an accident of history, but a fulfillment of divine will. The people need to believe in that destiny, Lucius. It gives them purpose, just as it gives Augustus power." Lucius pondered the poet's words, a new understanding dawning. Everywhere he looked, Augustus's image was there, etched in stone, cast in bronze, immortalized in verses. The emperor had crafted a persona of himself as a benevolent ruler, a man of peace who had brought an end to the civil wars, all while expanding Rome's borders and securing its future. The temples and statues that now filled the city were not just tributes to the gods, but to Augustus himself. His name would echo through the ages, not just as a ruler, but as the very embodiment of Rome's rebirth. "It seems as though everything in this city belongs to him now," Lucius said quietly. "Even the gods." Virgil's expression darkened, though he did not disagree. Augustus understands that the power of a ruler is not just in armies or laws, it is in the stories people tell. And he ensures that the stories they tell are the ones he wants them to believe. Lucius looked up at the towering columns of the Temple of Apollo, their pristine surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. He thought of the Arapagus, the Forum of Augustus, the countless statues that now lined Rome's streets, all part of a larger narrative, one that glorified not just the city, but the man who ruled it. In the temples and forums, in the verses of poets like Virgil, Augustus was more than a ruler. He was the savior of Rome, the chosen one who had restored order and peace. But Lucius couldn't help but wonder how much of it was real, and how much was a carefully constructed illusion. Rome was certainly more prosperous now than it had been during the chaos of the civil wars, but the cost had been high. Augustus' consolidation of power, his control over the Senate, and his manipulation of public perception had created a Rome that was unified, but at the expense of the very freedoms that once defined the Republic. As Virgil took his leave, Lucius returned to his work, but his thoughts were no longer on the stone before him. He could now see the broader picture, the way Augustus had woven his influence into the very fabric of Roman life. The statues, the temples, the poetry, it was all propaganda, a way to control not just the present, but the future. Every monument he worked on, every piece of marble he carved, was part of that greater scheme. The realization left Lucius unsettled. His craft, once a source of pride, now felt like a tool in the hands of a ruler whose ambition knew no bounds. As he chipped away at the stone, he couldn't shake the feeling that he too was being shaped, like all of Rome, by forces beyond his control. forces that wore the face of Augustus. Chapter 5. Return of the Lost Standards. The streets of Rome were alive with excitement, a low hum of anticipation rippling through the crowds gathered along the broad avenues leading to the Roman Forum. Lucius Marcellus stood among the masses, his eyes fixed on the distant arches of the Forum, waiting for the spectacle that was about to unfold. It was a day unlike any other, a day that would be remembered in the annals of Rome's history. Augustus, the man who had brought peace and order to the empire, was about to restore not just the honor of Rome, but its very soul. The air buzzed with conversation, and everywhere Lucius looked, people were talking about the same thing: the return of the Roman standards, the eagles that had been lost decades earlier in a disastrous defeat. It had been a humiliation that haunted the empire for years, a bitter reminder of Rome's vulnerability in the far-off sands of Parthia. Crassus, once one of Rome's most powerful generals, had marched into the east with grand ambitions, only to fall in battle, his legions annihilated, their standards captured by the Parthians. For years, those lost standards had been a symbol of Rome's disgrace, an open wound that Augustus had finally healed, not through war, but through negotiation. Lucius could scarcely believe it. As a child, he had heard his father and the older men of his family speak of the terrible loss at Carrhae, their voices tinged with anger and regret. The defeat had been a dark shadow over Rome's military pride, a story told with clenched jaws and grim faces. And yet, here they stood, about to witness the triumphant return of those very same standards, not through the bloodshed of another war, but through the calculated diplomacy of Augustus. The sound of trumpets cut through the chatter, and the crowd surged forward, craning their necks to see. Augustus was coming, leading a grand procession through the heart of the city. Lucius found himself pressed between eager onlookers, their excitement infectious. A distant shimmer of armor and banners caught the sunlight, and soon the procession emerged from the side streets, a wave of color and movement that swept toward the Forum. Roman legionaries, clad in their polished breastplates, marched in perfect formation, their spears glinting in the light, their faces stern and proud. And at the heart of it all was Augustus, riding atop a chariot, his figure unmistakable. Draped in a pure white toga, his head crowned with laurels, the emperor looked every bit the embodiment of Roman virtue and authority. In his hands, he held the most precious symbols of the day, the Roman standards, the eagles that had once been lost in the deserts of Parthia, now reclaimed and brought home for all of Rome to see. The crowd erupted into cheers as Augustus lifted the standards high, their golden wings gleaming in the sun. The sound was deafening, a roar of approval that seemed to shake the very stones beneath Lucius's feet. People shouted Augustus' name, their voices filled with awe and reverence. It was a moment of triumph, a public display of Rome's restored dignity, and it was clear that the emperor had orchestrated every detail to perfection. Lucius watched in awe, his mind flashing back to the stories he had grown up with. He could almost see the scene of Crassus's defeat, the Parthian cavalry sweeping across the plains, the Roman legions trapped and desperate, their proud banners torn from their grasp. It had been a disaster, a stain on Rome's honor that no amount of military victories could wash away. But now, Augustus had done what no other leader could. He had brought back the lost eagles, not through brute force, but through shrewd diplomacy. Standing there in the heat of the midday sun, Lucius marveled at the spectacle unfolding before him. Augustus had once again demonstrated his mastery of both military and political strategy. By recovering the standards, he had not only avenged the humiliation of Crassus's defeat, but had done so without shedding Roman blood. It was a victory as symbolic as it was real, and the people of Rome understood that. In their eyes, Augustus was not just a ruler. He was a savior, a man who had restored Rome's pride and dignity on the world stage. As the procession passed, Lucius found himself swept along with the crowd, cheering until his throat was hoarse. The standards, those sacred symbols of Rome's military might, glittered as they were carried through the streets, held high for all to see. Augustus smiled faintly, his eyes scanning the crowd, acknowledging their adulation. He had given the people what they craved: a sense of glory, a return to the ideals of a Rome that could not be defeated, even in the darkest moments of its history. But as Lucius watched the celebration unfold, a part of him could not help but wonder at the power of such symbols. The standards were just objects, pieces of metal and wood, carried into battle by men who had long since perished. And yet, they carried with them the weight of a nation's pride, the memory of its defeats and triumphs. Augustus understood this better than anyone. He had turned the return of these relics into a political triumph, using them to solidify his image as the protector of Rome's honor. The parade moved on, winding its way through the Forum and toward the Capitoline Hill, where the standards would be enshrined, a permanent reminder of Augustus's diplomatic victory. The cheers of the crowd followed them, growing louder as the banners disappeared from sight. Lucius stood in the aftermath of the procession, his heart still pounding from the excitement. All around him, people were talking animatedly, praising Augustus, their faces alight with admiration. For Lucius, the moment was bittersweet. He could not deny the power of what he had just witnessed, the way Augustus had united the city in a shared sense of pride. But he also knew that this was part of a larger game, one that Augustus played with unmatched skill. The emperor was not just a military leader or a politician. He was a master of public perception, of shaping how Rome saw itself and its place in the world. As the crowds began to disperse, Lucius lingered for a while, his eyes fixed on the distant banners that had faded from view. The standards were back in Rome, and with them, a renewed sense of imperial confidence. But Lucius wondered how long such confidence could last, and at what cost it had been bought. The Parthians had returned the standards, but Rome's ambitions remained. Augustus had won this victory without war, but how long before Rome found itself once again entangled in the conflicts that seemed to define its endless march toward expansion? With the echoes of the celebration still ringing in his ears, Lucius turned away from the Forum, his thoughts heavy. Rome had regained its lost symbols, but the empire's hunger for glory was far from sated. Augustus had given the people what they wanted today, but Lucius knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, and new questions about what it truly meant to be Roman. Chapter 6: Family and Succession. The sun filtered gently through the olive trees surrounding the villa of Livia, casting dappled shadows on the garden paths as Lucius Marcellus approached the grand estate. The villa, perched on the outskirts of Rome, was a place of serene beauty, its white walls gleaming in the afternoon light, surrounded by lush greenery and meticulously tended gardens. Yet beneath the calm facade of this imperial retreat, Lucius could sense the tension that now gripped the household. Augustus, the man who had reshaped Rome, was ill, and the question of succession, long whispered about in corners of power, was now a matter of open speculation. Lucius had been summoned to work on a new mosaic for the villa's atrium, a commission that spoke of Livia's influence and taste. As the wife of Augustus, Livia was more than just a figurehead. She was a shrewd political player, known for her quiet but decisive hand in the affairs of the empire. The villa itself reflected her influence, a place of tranquility, yet always alive with the hum of political discussion. Today, that hum was more palpable than ever. As Lucius set up his tools near the entrance of the atrium, he could hear voices from a nearby pergola, where several members of the imperial circle had gathered under the shade of grapevines. Livia herself sat among them, her posture poised and composed, as if the weight of the empire rested lightly on her shoulders. Beside her stood Tiberius, her son from a previous marriage, tall and austere, his expression unreadable. There was talk of Tiberius being groomed to succeed Augustus, but the situation was far from settled. The imperial family, it seemed, was rife with competition, each member vying for influence, for a place in the line of power. Lucius pretended to focus on his work, but his ears were attuned to the conversation that drifted toward him. The name of Agrippa surfaced, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the brilliant general who had been Augustus' closest ally and military commander. He had been married to Augustus' daughter Julia, making him part of the Julio-Claudian family. For years, many had assumed that Agrippa, with his strong ties to Augustus and his proven loyalty, would be the natural successor. But Agrippa had died suddenly, leaving behind young sons who, though potential heirs, were too young to assume leadership. "Rome needs a steady hand," one voice murmured, a senator's voice, calm but insistent. "Tiberius has the experience, the discipline. He's fought in the provinces, led legions. If anyone is to follow Augustus, it must be him." Livia nodded, her face betraying little, though Lucius could sense the weight of her unspoken thoughts. It was widely believed that she favored her son's rise to power, and she had always been known to quietly maneuver events to her advantage. But there were others who questioned Tiberius's suitability, not because of his ability, but because of his reserved, cold nature. The people of Rome had not warmed to him in the same way they had to Augustus, whose public persona was carefully crafted to project benevolence and strength. "Tiberius is capable," another voice replied, softer, as though weighing the risks. "But Agrippa's sons, Gaius and Lucius, they are of Augustus's bloodline. The people will look to them in time. Augustus has adopted them after all." The conversation shifted toward Augustus himself, his health now a matter of serious concern. The emperor had fallen ill several times in the last few years, and each bout seemed to weaken him further. Though he had always recovered, the question lingered: what would happen when he could no longer rule? Lucius had overheard these same concerns echoed throughout the city, among the craftsmen, the merchants, the soldiers who filled Rome's streets. Augustus had promised stability, but the future of Rome hung in the balance, teetering on the decisions being made within these private gardens. As Lucius worked, he caught fragments of a more heated debate from further down the path, where a group of senators and noblemen had gathered. Drusus, another prominent name in the conversation, was Augustus' stepson and Tiberius' younger brother. He had been a favored military leader, admired by the legions and beloved by the people. But Drusus had died in Germania, leaving behind a legacy of what might have been. His widow, Antonia, and their children were also drawn into the tangled web of succession, their futures uncertain in the ever-shifting dynamics of the imperial family. "Augustus has laid the groundwork for peace," said one senator, his voice rising with conviction. "But the question remains, who can keep it? The Senate has already lost its true power. The people will follow whoever commands the legions." Lucius chiseled carefully, his fingers guiding the small stones into place on the mosaic, but his thoughts were far from his work. The Senate, once the center of Roman power, now seemed increasingly irrelevant. Augustus had cleverly maintained its appearance of authority, but everyone knew that real power rested with the emperor and his family. What had once been a republic, with its values of shared governance and debate, was now shaped by personal loyalty, by bloodlines, and by the ambitions of a few. He glanced over at the pergola again. Livia spoke softly, her voice barely carrying over the distance, but her words carried the force of command. She was a woman who understood that the future of Rome was being built not in the Senate chambers, but in the private discussions and alliances forged here among the elite. Augustus's illness had thrown everything into sharp focus. Whoever would succeed him would need not just political acumen, but the ability to navigate the complex web of personal loyalties and rivalries that now define the empire. Lucius couldn't help but think back to his earlier years, when he had believed in the ideals of the Republic, when men like Cicero had spoken of the balance of power and the importance of tradition. Now, those ideals seemed little more than distant memories, replaced by the cold realities of imperial rule. Augustus had restored peace, yes, but it was a peace held together by the strength of his own hand and the hands of those who would follow him. By the time the sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow over the villa, Lucius had finished his work for the day. He stood back, admiring the mosaic he had been crafting, a pattern of vines and leaves that mirrored the natural beauty of the gardens around him. Yet, as he looked out over the sprawling estate, he could not shake the feeling that Rome itself had become a garden tended by the imperial family, where each branch and bloom was carefully cultivated to serve their purposes. As he gathered his tools, Lucius caught one final glimpse of Livia, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. She stood with Tiberius, their heads close together, speaking in hushed tones. Whatever future awaited Rome, it would be shaped by these conversations, these private moments where power was not debated in the Senate, but decided behind closed doors. As Lucius made his way back toward the city, he thought of the generations to come, of the emperors who would rise and fall, and of the family whose grip on Rome seemed as unyielding as the stones he carved. The Republic was gone, perhaps forever, and in its place stood an empire built on bloodlines, ambition, and the quiet maneuvering of a family that would stop at nothing to secure its place in history. Chapter 7. The Death of Agrippa. The sky hung heavy over Rome, a blanket of dull gray clouds pressing down upon the city as Lucius Marcellus stood among the gathered crowds. The streets, usually alive with noise and movement, were subdued, the usual bustling energy replaced by a solemn silence. The funeral procession for Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa wound its way slowly through the heart of Rome, passing beneath the towering monuments he had helped to build. It was a day of mourning, not just for the man who had been Augustus' closest ally, but for the empire itself. Lucius had never seen the city so still. The usual hum of voices and the clatter of carts on cobblestones were absent, replaced by the rhythmic shuffle of feet and the occasional distant sob from a grieving citizen. Agrippa had been more than a general. He had been the backbone of Augustus's reign, the man behind many of Rome's greatest victories. His name was synonymous with military genius, with the stability that had allowed Augustus to consolidate his power. And now, with his death, something in Rome felt unmoored, as if the very foundations of the city had begun to tremble. The procession moved slowly, led by soldiers in gleaming armor, their heads bowed in respect. Behind them, the bier carried Agrippa's body, draped in the rich, deep purple that signified his rank. His family followed closely, their faces marked by grief. Augustus himself was there, walking with deliberate slowness, his features as inscrutable as ever, though Lucius could see the strain in his movements. The emperor's loss was evident, not just in the way he carried himself, but in the quiet whispers that floated through the crowd. Agrippa had been his most trusted friend, the man he had turned to in times of crisis. Without him, the future felt uncertain. Lucius watched as the procession passed by, his thoughts drifting to the stories he had heard of Agrippa's campaigns. The decisive naval victory at Actium, which had secured Augustus' rule, the conquests that had expanded the empire's borders. Agrippa had been a man of action, of strength, and of loyalty. Now with his death, Lucius wondered what would become of Rome. Who would fill the void left by this great man? The answer seemed uncertain. Agrippa had been more than a general. He had been Augustus' son-in-law, married to the emperor's daughter Julia. Their union had produced heirs, young and untested, who would one day be expected to lead the empire. But they were still children, too young to take on the mantle of leadership. In the meantime, Augustus would have to rely on others, and that thought filled Lucius with unease. The balance of power was shifting again, and not in a way that boded well for stability. As the procession passed by the Areopagus, the altar of peace that Agrippa himself had helped to consecrate, Lucius felt a deep sense of loss. It was not just Agrippa who had passed. It was an era. The men who had shaped Rome, who had fought for its future, were disappearing, one by one. First, there had been the death of Drusus, another of Augustus' key allies, and now Agrippa. Each loss seemed to pull Rome further from the days of certainty, the days when Augustus's vision for the empire had felt unstoppable. Lucius thought back to the wars he had heard about in his youth, the battles that had defined Agrippa's legacy. He remembered the tales of Actium, where Agrippa had crushed the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, securing Rome's future under Augustus. It had been a decisive moment, a moment of triumph for the empire. But that triumph now seemed distant, overshadowed by the growing uncertainties of the present. As the procession neared the Forum, Lucius noticed the faces of the senators and noblemen who had gathered to pay their respects. There was an unease among them, a quiet tension that hung in the air. With Agrippa gone, the question of succession loomed larger than ever. Augustus was aging, and though his health had remained stable, the future was becoming increasingly fraught. The younger members of the imperial family, Tiberius, Gaius, and Lucius, were being prepared for power, but none had proven themselves in the way Agrippa had. Lucius overheard snatches of conversation from the crowd, whispers of concern about what would come next. Tiberius is capable, one voice said, but does he have the loyalty of the people? Agrippa was loved, respected, Tiberius, not so much. Another voice replied, and what of the boys, Gaius and Lucius? They are still too young, untested. Rome needs a leader, not a child. The uncertainty gnawed at Lucius as he listened. He had long known that the stability of Rome rested on Augustus's shoulders, but Agrippa had been the pillar that supported the emperor's vision. Without him, Rome felt vulnerable. The empire had grown vast, its borders stretching far beyond what Lucius had ever imagined possible. But with that growth had come new dangers: rebellions in the provinces, challenges from rival powers, and the ever-present threat of internal strife. As the funeral procession wound its way toward the mausoleum of Augustus, where Agrippa would be laid to rest, Lucius felt a deep heaviness settle over him. The monuments that lined the streets, the temples and statues that had been built to glorify the empire, now felt like hollow symbols of a greatness that was beginning to fade. Rome was still powerful, but its future seemed uncertain, as if the very ground beneath it was shifting. Agrippa's death had sent ripples through the empire, and Lucius knew that the days to come would be fraught with new challenges. Augustus would continue to rule, but without his most trusted general by his side, how long could the peace he had built truly last? The question lingered in Lucius's mind as he watched the procession disappear into the distance, the sound of the soldiers' measured footsteps fading into the quiet of the afternoon. The empire had lost one of its greatest men, and with that loss, the future seemed more precarious than ever. Chapter 8. A New Age Dawns. The streets of Rome were quieter now, bathed in the soft golden light of dusk, as Lucius Marcellus walked slowly toward the Areopagus. The altar of Augustan peace stood resplendent before him. its white marble walls glowing in the fading sunlight, the intricate carvings casting long shadows on the ground. It had been years since he first worked on the monuments that now filled the city. Years since he had stood in the presence of Augustus himself, watching the emperor build an empire out of the ashes of the Republic. Now, as an old man, Lucius found himself contemplating the Rome that had emerged, strong, proud, and unrecognizable from the city of his youth. The year was 2 BCE, and Augustus had just been declared Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. It was the final and greatest honor bestowed upon him, cementing his place not just as a ruler, but as the embodiment of Rome itself. Lucius had witnessed the proclamation earlier that day, standing among the crowd as the Senate, now a shadow of its former self, had gathered to declare Augustus the protector and patriarch of the Roman people. The cheers had been thunderous, the devotion of the people unquestionable. For most of them, there had never been another ruler. Augustus was their Rome. But as Lucius stood before the Areopagus, its grandeur now tinged with a sense of melancholy, he could not help but think of all that had been lost in the transformation. The Rome of his youth, with its fierce debates in the Senate, its public forums where citizens once spoke openly of politics and philosophy, was gone. In its place stood a city that, while peaceful and prosperous, was dominated by the will of a single man. Lucius's sons had grown up in this new world, a Rome where Augustus had ruled unchallenged for decades. They had never known the fear of civil war, the instability of shifting alliances, or the uncertainty of life in a divided republic. For them, Augustus was more than just an emperor. He was the bringer of peace, the man who had restored order and brought prosperity to the empire. Lucius often wondered how they would feel if they had lived through the tumultuous years he had, if they would still view Augustus with such unwavering loyalty. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a deep amber glow across the city, Lucius's mind drifted back to his early days, to the years when Rome had been caught in the grip of civil strife. He remembered the chaos after Julius Caesar's assassination, the wars that had torn the Republic apart, and the uncertainty that had plagued every Roman household. It had been a time of fear, when no one knew who would rise to power next or how long they would last. And then Augustus, once Octavian, had emerged, promising peace, and over time, delivering it. Lucius had been skeptical at first, as many were. Augustus had spoken of restoring the Republic, but his actions had told a different story. Slowly, methodically, he had consolidated power, ensuring that no rival could challenge him. The Senate, once the heartbeat of Roman political life, had become little more than an instrument of the emperor's will. Lucius had watched as old Republican values, debate, balance, the distribution of power, were replaced by the absolute authority of one man. Yet, for all the quieting of dissent, Rome had flourished. New roads stretched to the farthest reaches of the empire. The legions secured its borders, and its people, for the most part, lived without fear of war. Lucius stepped closer to the Areopagus, the delicate carvings coming into sharper focus as the evening light faded. The friezes depicted scenes of peace and prosperity, children playing, animals grazing, and the Roman people united under Augustus's reign. It was a vision of harmony, of a Rome that had left behind the violence of the past. And yet, as Lucius traced the lines of the carvings with his eyes, he could not help but feel the weight of all that had been sacrificed to achieve this peace. He thought of the men who had died in Augustus' wars of expansion, of the countless soldiers who had fought and bled on the frontiers so that Rome could grow ever larger. He thought of his own brother, Titus, who had been wounded in the campaigns in Hispania and had never fully recovered. Rome's peace had come at a cost, and for many, that cost had been steep. Agrippa, the the general who had been instrumental in securing Augustus' victories, was long dead. So too were many of the men who had fought alongside him, their names forgotten as history celebrated only the emperor who had led them. As the shadows deepened, Lucius felt a cool breeze brush against his skin. He had lived long enough to see the Republic die and the empire rise in its place. He had carved statues and temples that glorified Augustus, had watched as the emperor transformed Rome into a city of marble, a symbol of power and permanence. But for all the grandeur, for all the peace and prosperity, Lucius could not shake the sense that something essential had been lost. The Republic had been imperfect, fractured by ambition and conflict, but it had been a place where voices were heard, where power was shared, however unevenly. Now, all power rested in the hands of one man. Augustus had claimed to restore the Republic, but Lucius knew that the Rome of his youth was gone, replaced by an empire that would be ruled by emperors for generations to come. Lucius looked up at the Arapagus one last time, its white marble now bathed in the soft glow of the Roman twilight. It was a monument to peace, but also to a new Rome, one that had abandoned the ideals of the Republic in favor of stability and order. Augustus had given the people what they wanted, what they needed, after years of chaos, but Lucius could not help but wonder what would happen when Augustus was gone. Who would hold Rome together then? As he turned to leave, the streets of Rome quiet in the fading light, Lucius felt a deep sense of finality. A new age had dawned, one shaped by the will of a single man. His sons would live in a Rome that was stable, prosperous, and powerful. But it was no longer the Rome that Lucius had once known, no longer the Republic that had been the pride of its citizens. It was Augustus's Rome, and it would be for as long as the emperor's legacy endured.